Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. I had to say something in video form about the censorship of The French Connection, which became a real hot button issue among the entire film community when it was discovered that Disney had actually edited the film, not just for streaming, but for all available iterations. So that means your streaming copies that you purchased, even in the past, have now been updated to this edited and altered version, and all public screenings here in the US and on streaming platforms and even at film festivals have become this new alteration of the film. Now, this is unfortunately not news to me because last year I read something about this when there was a little bit of a rumble of this happening after people caught an airing of the film on Turner Classic Movies, and also had seen it turn up in another place or two. But there wasn't a whole lot of information about it. So I did make some posts on social media and tried to figure out a little bit about it, but unfortunately I couldn't ascertain it for myself, and also because I don't stream films, I wasn't able to actually check and see if this new edit was anywhere besides the handful of airings. It also felt like I was the tree falling over in the forest that nobody heard. So I was very surprised that this became such a significant news item this year when it reappeared on the Criterion channel, and then people started noticing this particular edit, and also that was showing up on all other platforms, and that their own streaming copies that had been purchased have now been updated to this altered version. And this is also played at film festivals and is pretty much now the de facto standard edition of the film everywhere in the US, except in Europe and other countries outside the US. It is still apparently the 2012 Blu-ray master without an edit. So this is apparently a US exclusive edit that seems directly tied to Disney's acquisition of the Fox library. Now, this is a dangerous precedent because it's not just a matter of censorship, it's a matter of going back and removing the original intended version of the film from all areas of circulation and making this bastardized version now the only version available for people to reference. Now, the edit itself is, of course, small. It is only one scene, but any edit that is done after the fact and done so poorly that it resembles an old broadcast television edit where a whole scene is pretty much lopped out, which is actually what happened here. They just ripped a whole part of a scene out of the film, and it's very noticeable because there's a jump cut and everything. It's just literally, ripped out. That reflects badly on everyone. It reflects badly on you. It reflects badly on the film, particularly for people who have never seen it before. And for a film as beloved and purposely challenging as The French Connection was, and the reason why it won Best Picture in 1971, because it was so challenging, to remove any of its impact, even in the slightest degree, for any film, alters it. So this is, of course, a terrible, reprehensible move that should not be tolerated by anyone, because The French Connection is still, to date, the greatest film ever made about the police. It's the best cop film ever made because of its unrelenting nature, because of its attention to realism, and because of it was a watershed moment for American cinema of fully integrating a lot of French New Wave techniques into what was seen as sort of a dead format genre in the cop thriller to make things as real and as vital as possible. It remains one of the great New York films. It remains one of the great car chase films, and it remains one of William Friedkin's masterpieces that does not get talked about enough or discussed enough today. It has not lost any of its impact, although apparently Disney felt the need to try and sanitize The French Connection of all things, a film that is entirely about the darkness and the grittiness and the nastiness inherent in humanity itself. The character of Popeye Doyle, played by Gene Hackman in his Academy Award-winning performance, is meant to be a mess of a human being. He's a wreck. He is essentially a bulldog of a cop who is driven only by the job and his personal demons. He is not a nice guy. He is directly a challenge to the notion of the heroic character in popular culture. So the fact that he is definitely a racist and just an alcoholic, a complete wreck of a human being, physically even, let alone mentally, is purposely part of the character and the characterization, and Hackman famously had difficulty getting into the character and being able to handle all the nastier aspects, and it was William Friedkin basically staying on him and helping him get to that level that made the performance even possible. So to alter that performance in any way, shape, or form, of course, also not only hurts the film, but also hurts the performance, because this is supposed to be an in-your-face, challenging character, just like the film. And the film builds to a climax that, once again, makes you question the nature of Doyle's actions. So if you dilute any of the characterization in any small way, you're altering the overall effect of the film, because that's what the whole film was about. That's what it builds up to. And not only does this scene remove it's really just a particular line of dialogue that apparently was objected to because it does contain a racial slur. However, it's not out of place for this character and this time in 1971 New York. It takes place at the opening of the film. It is the scene right after the opening in the police station where Doyle, played by Gene Hackman, and his partner Russo, played by the great Roy Scheider, are recovering from the opening. And because Doyle uses the N-word, that's apparently what automatically triggered Disney to censor the scene. And instead of just censoring the word or putting a disclaimer at the start of the film, if they felt the need to say anything about a 1971 film, they literally just took the whole scene out. They took the whole part of the scene out. So you see now in this altered version of the film, there's a literal jump to where they're actually just going out of the police station. And this is really the only alteration there is, but it is such a notable one. And the idea that Disney took it upon themselves to touch a frame of the French Connection, let alone any Fox film, which the only connection they have to these films is they bought the Fox library. You know, there should have been a clause or something that they were not allowed to touch these films because that's cultural vandalism. But this is Disney we're talking about. They've gotten away with this with their own films for decades now, and usually get rewarded for it too. So this is also warranted because their revisionism needs to stop, and this needs to be the line in the sand, and people need to be aware of these things. And films should be legally protected in this way. If their copyright is going to be protected, then they should be protected from being altered and changed by faceless corporations who simply purchase them. That should not give you the right to alter or change said films in any way, shape, or form, because to do so is cultural and artistic vandalism. In addition to simply ripping this scene out simply because of a single word that Popeye uses, and this is done on purpose to very quickly at the start of the film, if you weren't already aware that Popeye was a problematic character, well, this just underlines it, and it puts it right in your face that this guy he's not a nice guy, and he's a very messed up person. But unfortunately, it seems like in this world that you have to have truly messed up people in certain roles, and while they might be so full of negative aspects and such a wreck of a human being, that may be, in some instances, the only type of person that can fulfill that role. So in ways, it ties in to a lot of what you see in the same year as Dirty Harry, who is also a very questionable character. So there is a connecting line between Popeye Doyle and Dirty Harry in that sense, and that was intended because these films are challenging, and that's why they're masterpieces, because they're not afraid to get into the negative aspects of humanity and to rub the audience's face in it and really challenge the audience to think for themselves and to understand that there are great negative aspects in day-to-day life, and there are negative aspects in humanity that we have to confront and examine. Otherwise, these things are just going to continue. But this scene continues. It's a back and forth between the two partners about the opening, and the slur that Popeye uses is one word in one sentence, and it's just thrown off. But again, it's there to underline that this is a messed up character. But it's actually not the important line in the scene, because in the back and forth, Popeye comes back with another retort, which is actually the truest line of his entire character in the film, and now that has been removed from the film because whoever did this, it's almost like it was done by an AI bot in terms of, oh, this word is flagged, oh, we just take this whole section out, because they've removed Popeye's follow-up line, because the line in question is never trust, and then the racial slur referring to the character that gets interrogated in the opening sequence that had just happened. But his comeback line is never trust anyone, which is the central line to understanding Popeye's character. He doesn't trust anyone. He's incapable of trusting anyone. That's why he can't work with anyone for the most part. And the only person who is able to even try to work with Popeye Doyle is his partner. And that's part of why Roy Scheider's performance is so phenomenal, that he's having to do all of these things in the characterization to show how a more normally adjusted cop can work with Popeye Doyle, and what he has to do, and how he has to integrate himself into Popeye's working methods, and also try to smooth things over and keep him from going off the deep end. That's their relationship dynamic. That's their working dynamic. And that's what we see established right there in the opening and maintained through the rest of the film. So by ripping this chunk out, again, it's extremely detrimental to the film and extremely detrimental to the characterizations, because this is right at the opening, and this is also firmly establishing the dynamic of these two for the entirety of the film. They are able to talk amongst themselves. They are able to relate in some ways, but you can also see that there's an impenetrable barrier between the two. No one gets through to Popeye 100% because he doesn't trust anyone. That is the key line of his entire character, and the way Hackman delivers it with a sort of almost maybe a degree of relish, but an intensity, and just an immediate intensity. There's no hesitation to saying that, and that is the biggest problem with this edit. They didn't focus on the one line. They just ripped this whole section out and caused a noticeable jump cut. And that's just like all the decades of seeing films on television where this stuff could happen. Or they got a bad print that was missing frames or missing scenes, or it was cut down for time, or it was time compressed. I mean, these problems have never quite gone away, and they still happen with films, and people just don't know about it until it's discussed or it's brought to their attention, or they discover it for themselves and go, wait, what the heck? And this also goes into the problem that you have people who are talking about this and very upset, as they should be, but instead of going after Disney, who is seemingly the culprit behind all of this, because this seems to have been tied into their acquisition of the Fox library, because this particular edit didn't exist before, but they're getting mad at the Criterion Channel and others who are simply being provided said masters. And unfortunately, a lot, if not the majority, of people releasing or exhibiting films, in terms of companies, streaming, art house theaters, physical media labels, television stations or networks and things, they have to use what they're given. But a great majority of them are not always going to be on top of or aware of films being edited and things. Not everyone actually goes through or looks at the masters they're provided with, and you shouldn't really have to. You should be able to go on what you're provided by the actual studio who made the film or who currently owns it, because of course Disney didn't make any Fox film. They just paid cash for the library and think they can do whatever they want with it, which again should be illegal. But unfortunately, films are not properly respected or protected in this country, because they are still not respected as an art form. But you run into this problem a lot of times where films in exhibition or on streaming, or however you're seeing them, are actually compromised in some way. Most of the time, it's on the technical side of things, particularly in the audio. Film audio is so badly manipulated and so badly treated, and because it's not as obvious as seeing issues or technical problems in the picture quality of a film, however you're seeing it, film sound frequently gets ignored for catalog titles. But the majority of films do not even have their original audio presentations available. It's almost always a remix or a complete from the ground up remix, which goes completely against the original sonic intent of the film, and of course is completely an example of revisionism. But then you get into problems in the picture in terms of color timing issues, or simply put, errors, bugs, mistakes, screw-ups that get baked into said master, and then that becomes the standard version in exhibition and available to the general public until someone else makes a new master or a new restoration, if they ever do that at all. So there are countless films currently that are still stuck with issues in picture or sound, or have technical problems or transfer issues, and they get baked in, and that's all you can do is you see this version. If it gets a revival screening at an art house, it's going to be from a DCP most likely, which has these problems baked in because it's basically a DCP of the old HD master or the Blu-ray master or the 4K UHD master. But we usually aren't having to deal with actual censorship and revisionism decades after the fact by another corporate entity simply because there is an objectionable word that was originally put there for a specific reason, and because the film was trying to be as realistic as humanly possible at the time, made sense within the context of the scene. And you have to see this film with historical context, because without that, it's going to be definitely perplexing to a 2023 audience. And I think everyone would understand that coming to the film for the first time. It's very obviously not a 2023 film. But for Disney to now go in and conform every available version and all streaming versions, including versions people had already purchased and had in their digital library, to this new altered version of the film, is a new low even for them, and it sets a dangerous precedent moving forward for what anyone or any corporate entity can do to any film, regardless of its classic status, because The French Connection is not an obscure film. It is one of, if not the most important film in its genre. It is a multiple Academy Award winner. The fact that the Academy themselves did not speak out on this issue, I think, is absolutely reprehensible, because they, of all people, should have at least said something. We still have not heard anything from William Friedkin, who you would think would be up in arms all over this, because if anybody was going to be upset about any of his films being changed, it would be William Friedkin, particularly in this way, in such a horrible slipshod manner. But also, Friedkin is known for liking to go in and change his own films and tweak them in the technical aspects, as happened with the debacle of the film's first release on Blu-ray in 2009, with the hideous master that he supervised in terms of the hideous picture quality and color grading and the experimental approach, and not presenting a version of the film as originally shot and intended and viewed up until that point. So there's not really been anything official that has been said outside of the Criterion channel issuing a statement and saying that this was the version they were provided with, and it was labeled as a director's edit, which seems even more insulting by Disney, because there is no way in hell that William Friedkin approved this type of edit of The French Connection by simply just ripping a scene out. Again, this is the type of thing that you would expect from the old days of broadcast television of, oh, well, we need to censor this part because it's too objectionable for television, so let's just, they got better at this over time, but they used to, of course, literally just take out whole segments. That's the type of edit we have here. They just literally ripped out a whole short segment of The French Connection and expect no one to say anything. I mean, it boggles the mind. And honestly, there hasn't been enough anger and frustration over this, because again, this is a dangerous precedent that moving forward, particularly at the Disney company, since their acquisition of the entire Fox library that they then proceeded to essentially lock away as if it was something they were throwing in the Disney vault, which again is cultural vandalism, because you're blocking away an entire division, an entire section of Hollywood history, and pretending like films don't matter and that they're not artwork and they're just simply a commodity for you to monetize whenever you feel like it. They clearly do not care anything for catalog titles, and their decades of revisionism have proven that time and time again, to the point of actually going in and basically tearing apart the original Disney animated classics to within an inch of their life in picture and sound, right down to even reanimating original materials, which just, you would think that people would say something, but unfortunately outside of fan circles, no one really goes into any of this. So this is just an unprecedented move by any studio to alter such an iconic film and in this sort of way, and then to make it the de facto standard version overnight without saying anything, and people just discovering this. This, of course, led to a giant mad rush on older video copies, and that meant that all of a sudden the old standard Fox editions that were in plentiful numbers and rather inexpensive, and things that people should have had in their physical media libraries for years already, because it is the French Connection, of course, suddenly went out of stock and started going for crazy prices on eBay, regardless of whichever version that you were looking at. And so it's important to look at the home video versions, because it's going to become a matter of not only preserving films in terms of having them available by cultivating your own physical media library, because these corporations can decide to remove access to films whenever they feel like it, or to change and alter them in however form they wish whenever they feel like it, and you're just supposed to like it, and you're not supposed to say anything. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is there's a lot of different iterations of the film, and there is one particular issue that is very glaring that never gets discussed, that is very important in regards to this film, that I have mentioned on social media, because not a lot of people, well, I've never seen anyone actually really go into this issue. And also, it's another reason why the 2012 Signature Series Blu-ray is so important. So to talk a little bit about the home video editions, so if you're looking for a copy of the film to have in your physical media library, and you're also trying to not pay the exorbitant prices that unfortunately the film is now going for, and of course the film does need a 4K scan and release badly. It needs a 4K UHD of a perfect archival transfer with the original mono mix of the film, all the old extras, perfect accurate archival-minded color grading, and of course no editing whatsoever. And to be honest, that's what Disney should do to admit how horribly wrong they were to do this in the first place, and to also admit the fact that their revisionism has gone off the deep end, and they need to actually care about the films that they themselves purchase or hold or own the rights to, because without those films, the Disney Corporation would not exist at all whatsoever. And to violate the artistic integrity of motion pictures in any way, shape, or form, if you are supposed to be a film studio, even though you're a conglomerate doing many other things, is to go against the entire nature of what you're supposed to be doing in the first place. And you're also caretakers of these films. You are not people who are supposed to go in and change or alter those films in any way. You are simply caring for them while you own them. You are a caretaker. You are, at best, a museum curator, because these are art treasures and they do belong in a museum. They don't belong in your hands to change or alter however you feel like it at that particular time. So the video editions are, of course, many and plentiful of the French Connection. However, they were always old standard def masters. They date all the way back to the early opening days of home video in the late 1970s, and that's when we saw the first couple releases from, of course, Magnetic Video, who did the Fox library, and the French Connection was one of Fox's biggest, most notable films of the 70s, so of course it got an early release. Now these today are of course incredibly rare, highly collectible, and I've not unfortunately been able to see an original magnetic video copy. However, the quality is going to leave a lot to be desired, because you are talking about a very, very early days of home video, magnetic video release of a Fox film. Of course, even though it's the French Connection from 1971, and we're talking about a tape release from, say, 1979, 1980, it's going to be better off than, a Fox film from the 50s being released on magnetic video at the time. What's important about this, though, is this is just about the only version of the film with its original mono mix on the entirety of its home video history, because very quickly, for some reason, and it may be because this is Friedkin already doing some of his technical revisionism. The French Connection is almost always heard or presented in an alternate sound presentation. For most of its home video history, it is a stereoized version of the mono track. It is one of the very early attempts to try and make a mono track into stereo using essentially basically turning it into a fake stereo track by using electronic reprocessing and rechanneling. This is something that did happen throughout the 80s into the 90s even. And it was thankfully a practice that wasn't very widely adopted, but it did unfortunately affect certain films rather quickly in the history of home video, and then they got stuck that way. The French Connection is a very notable one because after the magnetic video release, and then as far as I'm aware, the only other version at this point or around this time that has a version of the film's original mono mix is a bilingual Japanese Laserdisc copy in a 1.33 ratio, because all early copies before the early 90s of the French Connection, even though it's a spherical film, were of course opened up and reformatted to television, and of course that means a 1.33 to 1 transfer. But this one Japanese Laserdisc does seem to have the original mono mix, but it's part of a bilingual Laserdisc, which doesn't have digital audio because it's an early disc, and of course this means you're having to deal with the noisier Laserdisc analog track, and it's only the left channel because it's bilingual, so the left channel has the original mono mix of the film, and the right channel has a Japanese dub of the film, and of course that Laserdisc, being Japanese, has hard-coded Japanese subtitles in the picture. So not really the intended way to watch the film, but on home video for most of the film's life, those are the only two iterations that I'm aware of that actually have the film's original audio mix. Now, the stereoized version was how everybody saw and heard the film on all the television airings, on all video releases, on VHS and Beta and Laserdisc throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. The only other version of the film that I believe has the mono mix, so this is probably a third version, is the original CED release of The French Connection. And CED is, of course, notoriously finicky as a format to even get it working properly and have a working player, and it's a very hard format to work with, especially now in 2023. But even with the limited audio quality that is available on the CED format, at least that way, you should also be able to hear the original mono mix of The French Connection. Fox didn't really spruce up the film at all, outside of making newer editions in better quality in terms of the tape and the packaging, and eventually adding, hi-fi sounds to the later VHS releases in the mid to late 1980s, which of course is a big benefit over the linear VHS audio track. But it's still the reprocessed for stereo mix that's on all the iterations. Even the CED, I believe, has the reprocessed for stereo version of the audio. And that's how the film stayed until we came to the early 90s, when Fox had really gotten into focusing more on their Laserdisc titles and had started making letterbox releases, which really started with their letterbox release of Die Hard. And so that's when we got what I have here as the letterbox double feature set on Laserdisc of both The French Connection and its sequel, French Connection 2, which is rarely discussed and very underrated, actually. So if you've never seen it, I do highly recommend it, even though it is not as good as the first film. There's a lot of really interesting material to recommend it for. But this brought together both films with brand new, at the time, widescreen masters. You were finally being able to see them in a widescreen ratio, and they both have digital audio as PCM. However, while the sequel is still with its original mono mix, because thankfully it was not remixed as the original film was, the French Connection is still stuck with a stereoized version of the mono track. And from what I've sampled of some of the older releases, it does seem like the same mix, but the quality is, of course, better, because here you've got a PCM track on a Laserdisc, and it's a much cleaner transfer and a much cleaner presentation than the older tapes I've tried. So unfortunately, while this was the film's first letterbox presentation, and it's a good, solid disc and master for the time, this isn't a big, fancy special edition, and it doesn't have the original mix mix of the film untouched, which would have been a great reason to own this Laserdisc. So unfortunately, the stereoized version still continues here. And that runs on to the 1996 final pressing of just the first film, which I have here, which got a nice updated jacket. It did get a slightly spiffed up pressing because, of course, this is 1996, and in the Laserdisc days, even a year between pressings could mean a significant difference in picture quality. So this was, of course, the best looking release of the film to date, and is basically a standalone version of what we got in the earlier double feature set. So this also means this unfortunately carries the same stereoized version of the film's audio on the PCM track. So again, we don't have the original untouched mono mix of the film, and this is otherwise, just like the previous release, the best and only widescreen iteration of the film on home video up to that point. This is how it stood for all the iterations of the film, and I should say that all of the later 90s and into early 2000s VHS releases of The French Connection were 1.33 framing versions of the Laserdisc master. They did do a new VHS master at that time, and it seems like they're derived completely from the Laserdisc master, and of course have the stereoized audio. So I've checked some of those, and that was the version I grew up with. So I was always wondering what the original mono mix of the film was, because I noticed even as a kid that for some reason The French Connection was in stereo, and it was a 1971 film, and even then I started wondering about things like this, and I noticed that certain films had gotten stuck like this. Other notable examples being Dirty Harry and Bullet, because Warner Brothers decided to stereoize them after their very first VHS and beta releases, and early, like very early Laserdiscs and Japan especially. And then after that, they've always been stereoized or remixed, just like The French Connection. So those are other films from around the same era that have had the same audio history on home video. Then we come to the 2001 DVD, the 5-star collection version, which I have in the lovely Golden Award Series repackaging with the same general artwork. This was a brand new master of the film. This was done as a sort of quasi-restoration project at the time, and featured new color timing, much greater quality over what was even on the Laserdisc masters, a whole bunch of new extras, but it also gave us a brand new 5.1 remix of the film with some new effects and things, and that just exacerbated the audio problem because there was also no presentation of the original mono mix once again, even though you could have done that because there are alternate tracks on the disc and plenty of space for that. So it should have been done at the time, but in the heyday of DVD, the focus was always on everything had to be a 5.1 mix because people loved purchasing systems and they wanted every film to be in 5.1, regardless of it being a very grungy mono mix like we had on The French Connection, because this film was never designed for multi-channel audio, and it's very apparent when you actually sit down and listen to the film, and particularly its original mix. This is not a multi-channel sonic experience. It's not supposed to be. It wasn't designed for that. So I really despise the 5.1 remix on this, and that became the new standard audio of the film. There's also a Dolby Surround Matrix version included, which of course doesn't get as aggressive in your face with its remixing as the discrete 5.1, but again is not the original mono mix of the film. However, on the DVD there is a mono track. It's the original French dub, and you can actually hear much more how the film originally sounded. And then of course every time somebody opens their mouth it's a 1970s dub in French, but that's actually a workaround you can do on a lot of films where if you look at the foreign language options, sometimes like here you get an older dub or the original theatrical release dub, which of course is just dubbing over the original audio mix of the film. So there's quite a number of films that are stuck with terrible remixes that if you want to actually hear how they originally sounded, you have to go and listen to a usually poor quality alternate foreign language dub on the in the other audio options of the disc, and that's what you can do with The French Connection if you have the DVD. And I admit I used to do that all the time because I was curious, and I heard how much better even an old French dub sounded than the remixes, and how much more it felt like how the film should sound. So unfortunately, that's how it stood in regards to the French Connection up until 2009. So this means all of the releases, which was basically just repackaging the 5-star DVD over and over, sometimes without the second disc of supplemental features, and so you had to make sure you got the 2-disc version, and all television airings, all broadcast versions, all presentations of the film theatrically or at film festivals, because I think they had prints made of this new purported restoration, which I think was done in 2000 for the 2001 DVD release. Every version of the film was this new version in terms of the color timing and this new master with the new audio remix. Then 2009 rolls around and we get the first release of the film on Blu-ray, which is one of the worst Blu-rays ever made, because William Friedkin came in and he later said that it was ill-advised and he was kind of misled, or it wasn't the intended visuals that he saw in the mastering suite, and it turned out differently. But essentially what he did was an experimental take on how he thought the French Connection should look at that time. And instead of presenting the film as is, by having a second disc with a new scan of the film as is, properly color graded and timed, he did all of this processing by trying to desaturate the image and add additional noise and play around with the image to such a degree that it is a completely different film. It is a complete alteration, and very much like what would be termed a fan edit in a lot of ways. It's an experiment, and while I can understand the rationale for why he did that and what he was going for, like that's understandable. And yes, he is the director, and yes, directors can have the right to change things if they want to, but that shouldn't supplant or completely replace or remove the original version from circulation, which is what unfortunately this disc did. And once again, it had the audio remix, and this was such a horrid presentation that Owen Roizman, the film's original cinematographer, publicly shamed Fox for putting this out and publicly said how horrible and appalling this disc was. And thankfully people at Fox listened. And even Friedkin said that, again, released a statement that, it didn't turn out how he intended, although it is still debatable on just how true that statement is, because he does have a habit of going back in and changing his own films. Of course, The Exorcist many times. He's even redone the color timing and audio of Cruising more than once. So it's any Friedkin film that gets a reissue or a new master, you do have to worry about there is some revisionism. Even Sorcerer on its Blu-ray has a little bit of that, but most people don't get into these things. But anyway, thankfully, that 2009 Blu-ray was very, very quietly sort of shifted aside, and then we eventually got the 2012 Signature Series Blu-ray, which I have here with the original slipcover, but you can always tell this is the Signature Series edition by the updated artwork, just a still of Popeye Doyle on the front, very simple looking, and it's labeled the Signature Edition. This is a brand new master. It was supervised by Owen Roizman, so this is cinematographer approved, not the 2009 director approved debacle, which again is one of the worst Blu-rays of all time. It's one of the worst physical media releases of all time. But this is the version you want to track down. This is the version that suddenly skyrocketed overnight to, at some points, over $350 on eBay for what was normally a disc that sold at retail for $9.99. This is a standard Fox disc. It has most of all the old special features. I don't think it has 100% of everything for the DVDs, so you do want to hang on to that for those few extras. And of course, it doesn't have the exclusive about my new screwy version of the French Connection fluff piece from the 2009 French Connection Blu-ray, and honestly, nobody misses that. So, but if you're an absolute completist and you also want to hang on to that absolutely hideous, legendarily bad presentation of the French Connection, you can hang on to the 2009 Blu-ray, although I don't know why anyone in their right mind would do that. But anyway, this has a correct presentation of the film. It is the best iteration of the film on home video we've ever seen. And while it definitely has room for improvement, particularly now in 2023, and the film does need a 4K UHD release, properly archivally minded with 0 edits and the original mono mix fully and properly restored, this is still one of the better treatments of a Fox catalog title in the Blu-ray age. And thankfully, this has stayed in print, although with it now having been sold out everywhere and constantly fluctuating in and out of stock, it seems like these are just all the leftover old Fox copies, and it is unfortunately very unlikely that Disney will print any more because of their status on trying to put the whole Fox catalog in moratorium. So do not pay the insane prices for this disc, but definitely try to get a copy at an affordable price as soon as you can, because once it's gone completely from retailer stock, it's probably unfortunately not going to come back around anytime soon. But the real importance of this disc for not only getting most of all the old extras, a proper presentation from the best scan currently available, and making for a really solid 2012 Blu-ray presentation, this does still have remixed audio. That's the default track. However, something that is not really advertised, hardly ever discussed, and you wouldn't really know it unless you scrutinized the technical information or you put the disc in and you went to the audio options. Like a good number of later Fox DVDs and Blu-rays, this actually does, as a lossy alternate secondary audio track, contain the original mono mix of The French Connection, making it the very first release since the dawn of home video to actually have the film's original mono audio without alterations or stereo rechanneling or processing on a disc release. So that alone, even more than having a correct transfer, was the gigantic reason to own this disc, and that blew my mind when this came out. I could not believe the fact that there was finally a release of The French Connection with its original mono audio. Even though it's in lossy quality, it is so unbelievably more powerful and better and more intrinsic to a 1971 production than the remix audio. And being able to toggle between the mono mix and the remixes will show you vividly how horrible the practice of remixing film audio on catalog titles is, because this really puts you in the experience, whereas the remix frequently takes you out of the experience and adds all kinds of bells and whistles and has fluctuating levels all over the place and goes against the original mono mix frequently, if not anywhere possible, particularly, of course, in the iconic car chase. This is a prime example you could use in film school of why remixed audio is bad. And of course, this stuff should be gone over in film school, but film school doesn't care about the nitty gritty of film preservation or sound mixing or revisionism of films, or doesn't ever go into the fact that most film schools are using physical media copies to screen films, and the vast majority of even physical media copies are not 100% archival in their presentations, particularly in their audio. So, you're using copies of films that have been at least altered in some way in an educational form and talking about the work in its original status when you're exhibiting it not in its original status. So these issues continue to build and percolate, and unfortunately they've never been addressed officially. But anyway, the point I'm making is the real importance of the 2012 disc and why it is the version to own. And if you need a version of The French Connection in your physical library, it has to be the 2012 Signature Series Blu-ray. And this is, of course, unfortunately, the disc, since it's the most recent version, and the Blu-ray that didn't have the horrible Friedkin-supervised debacle transfer. This is the version that's become the one everybody's searching for and trying to get and not pay the crazy eBay prices for. And it's even more important because it's the only version that actually has the film's original audio mix presentation. And that's such an important factor. And it's been gone for so long, practically since the early 1980s. And by that, I mean, it's been gone since like 1982. So the fact that people don't know this kills me, because we didn't even know we were going to get this back when this came out, that it was going to actually have, just tacked on there and almost sneaking in there. Oh yeah, we threw the original audio on the film there, but nobody cares about things like that. It just that sort of approach, just it boggles the mind that film audio is so disrespected and continues to be disrespected to this day. But the real importance of the Signature Series release is not only for having a correct transfer and being the best release of the film to date in terms of overall quality, and having the majority, if not all, of the old extras of relevance, but it does actually include the film's original mono mix, and so that's why you do need to try and move heaven and earth to get a copy on the Signature Series Blu-ray release. It is far and vastly beyond what you see on the old DVD master. So if you're one of the people who has the film on DVD and you think that's fine, I understand that. However, the quality difference is dramatic. It's not just going from DVD to Blu-ray. It is a dramatically improved master. It's not a perfect master, but even the color grading of the Signature Series Blu-ray is far beyond the old color grading of the DVD. But even more than that, you are actually getting the option to see the film as originally exhibited in 1971 with its original mono audio mix. And to do that without the Signature Series Blu-ray, you have to go all the way back to the dawn of home video and look at copies from before 1982. So you're basically looking at the original magnetic video VHS with a dubious transfer at best, and that random, very early bilingual Japanese analog audio laserdisc I mentioned, and the CED release. So those are just my general thoughts on the issue of Disney's censorship of The French Connection, and also a lot of my overall thoughts and the overall landscape of films today, and how they are seen as mere products and commodities to be changed or altered whenever their current owners feel like it. And then those become the versions in circulation and the versions of record. And for some films, unfortunately, they become stuck that way for so long. And it's almost as if that is now the permanent iteration of said film. And if this channel or my creative or professional life has any meaning, it is to fight against that tooth and nail, and to make people become more aware of just how important it is to actually pay attention to transfers and presentations of films, because they get so frequently altered or changed from their original presentation, sometimes in ways that, of course, people don't realize. But these are important issues that just don't get discussed in the way that they should. But also, I wanted to highlight the importance of the Signature Series Blu-ray from 2012, and the fact that it is the only major modern release to have the original audio track of the film actually present. Every other version is a remix, or dating back to the old video era, reprocessed or rechanneled for stereo version. So every other version of the film, except for the very earliest, not very good home video releases from the early 1980s and late 70s, have a compromised presentation because they don't have the original audio mix of the film. It's been processed, it's been rechanneled, it's been tweaked, it's been redone, and then when you get to the modern remixes, they've been remixed from scratch and have new effects and new volume levels, and they are completely revisionist. So that's why it is so vital and important to have the Signature Series Blu-ray in your collection. Again, it is now very difficult to find a copy of this that is not exorbitantly priced. It has been coming back into stock at major retailers at the normal price, but it's very fleeting. You have to catch it at the right time, because apparently they find maybe another batch in the warehouse or in storage. So some people have had luck if they're just constantly watching the Amazon page or other retailers and just pounce on it when it comes back into stock. So you can go that route, or you should also be looking at local stores if you have any for used media. You might be able to stumble across a used copy at a decent price, but I'm sure, and I've seen even, unfortunately, the 2009 Blu-ray with the horrible freaking supervised debacle transfer has been going for higher dollar amounts, because people mistakenly think that's the film on Blu-ray, and they just need it in their library and they don't want it edited. But unfortunately, you do need to stay away from the 2009 disc. So any iteration of the 2009 disc with this particular cover art needs to be avoided like the plague, because it's, again, one of the worst disc releases of all time. So always make sure you're getting the 2012 Signature Series Blu-ray, which has this artwork. Either with or without the slipcover, the artwork is the same. And if you're still not sure what disc you're looking at, just look on the back at the copyright date. If it's 2012 and onward, that's what you need. If it's anything before 2012, especially if it says 2009, just You kill it with fire, just immediately throw it away. But also, even the DVD has at some points been going for silly money on eBay, which is really crazy because the DVD is ultra common and you shouldn't have to pay more than $1 or $2 for it in a used shop. So that's when you get into really silly territory. And that again doesn't have the original audio and has a particular color timing for the DVD. So it is what it is. But definitely don't pay an exorbitant price for the old DVD because that shouldn't cost you more than $2. So to summarize, the censorship of the French Connection is wrong. It was poorly done and done without care, and it also should not have become the new de facto standard version of the film. If you were going to do this at all, it should have remained only a broadcast iteration or streaming iteration at the most, although streaming should not have the same constraints that broadcast television does in terms of censorship and editing. At first I wondered if this was some old broadcast television edit that had mistakenly gotten used, and that is actually possible since there is so little information. It could have just mistakenly been labeled as the standard main version, and since people don't pay attention to things and they don't double check things, it just keeps getting sent out and used for everything in this country. Because again, if you look at the French Connection in other countries, it is still the uncut version, although it's almost always got the remixed audio on it. And the fact that it's unedited still outside the US makes all of this even more nonsensical, because why was this done? What was the rationale? Was anybody thinking? Was this an automated process? Because it kind of seems like it. And if they're going to defend trying to censor or edit the French Connection, well, just as a case in point example for this being a dangerous precedent, and this could happen further on down the line with other films for whatever reason, does that mean that you're going to censor or change anything in 1971 Shaft? Because this is another of the iconic New York films dealing with the culture and time period of New York at that place and time to such a degree, just like the French Connection, that it becomes a time capsule for 1971 New York. And on top of that, they share the same screenwriter. Both films were written by Ernest Tidyman, who created the Shaft character, but also wrote the screenplay of the French Connection. So because there is objectionable dialogue contained in Shaft, just like the French Connection, shot at the same time, released in the same year, with the same screenwriter, with the same grungy, amazing time capsule New York that no longer exists, does that mean that you're going to change or remove any dialogue in Shaft because it is now considered objectionable? Because the same rationale could apply, to both films, and they share the same screenwriter, so, and they were released in the same year and shot on the same locations, so if they're going to take an entire scene out of the French Connection, there's no telling what they would do to Shaft if they owned it. But, thankfully Shaft is under MGM, who licensed their new 4K scan for this Criterion release. But had the same thing been done to Shaft, an entire short scene had been removed in the same way, there would have been the same uproar. And I just think it's an interesting comparison to make, because this could happen at any time now to any film for whatever reason, and we wouldn't even get a reason because Disney has still not officially addressed things and not given a reason. And again, it's entirely possible this could simply be a mistake, and the edit could have been for broadcast television, and this somehow got mislabeled and sent out. However, I don't think that's the case. I think this was literally just an automated thing, and somebody did that and didn't pay any attention to making it less abrupt, and you're just supposed to accept this. This is cultural and artistic vandalism. This is not something that should be accepted. This is not something that anybody should do, and it sets a dangerous precedent for all films moving forward. So the backlash is simply not enough, even with the massive online outpouring of frustration that has happened. And this needs to be officially acknowledged, and this needs to be officially addressed, and the censoring of any film does not need to continue or occur. The altered, bastardized version, however small the alteration is, of the French Connection does not need to be the version in circulation. It does not need to be the version on streaming. It does not need to be the version that takes over all in all of people's streaming libraries. Blu-rays. It does not need to be shown at film festivals. It does not need to be shown on television or in any way of a presentation that's supposed to be celebrating the iconic status of the film, because you're now showing a compromised version of the film that has been changed by someone else decades after the fact, and has, even if the alteration is small, it is still an alteration nonetheless. So if you can tell, I am very hot and bothered about this topic, because the preservation of films is very near and dear to me, and of course the entire reason why I started this channel in the first place. So I am very glad that at least people are speaking out about this, and it became a news item. I just wanted to put this video together to go into a bit of greater detail and also talk more about why the Signature Series Blu-ray is so important, and about how the film has been without its original audio mix for the vast majority of its entire home video history, and why you need to get a copy of the Signature Series Blu-ray for your own collection for that reason alone, in addition to having a proper transfer, because there's unfortunately not enough information about the actual releases and how to navigate and what release to look for in terms of all the news stories that have come out, and people have been mistakenly buying the first Blu-ray or just sticking with the DVD, which is a mistake, really, because the Signature Blu-ray is the way to go in picture, and especially because of containing the original mono mix of the film. So definitely get a copy of the Signature Blu-ray if you possibly can. It is that important. Do not support any type of revisionism of films. Do not support Disney's stance on this. Definitely be as vocal as possible if you feel the need to do so about this issue. And I think all film fans should stand united on this, because there's no argument that can possibly defend their stance, and this sets a dangerous precedent moving forward for every film, because there's no telling if something this small and something in the French Connection of all films is going to have this happen. There's no telling moving forward what any entity is going to do with any catalog film. So I do hope my babbling about the video releases of the French Connection in this issue has been at least somewhat helpful and informative, and I hope that you are able to track down a copy of the 2012 Signature Series Blu-ray if you haven't already, and hopefully you can also find it at the original, $10 list price, and not have to pay the insanely exorbitant eBay prices it's been going for. This is a very unfortunate and very upsetting situation for all cinephiles, because moving forward, there's no telling what could be on the chopping block, and that is a very legitimate fear and concern, and it is important to discuss these issues and not let them just slip by, because if you do that, they think they can get away with these things, and they think that continuing with these practices is a good thing, and this should be the point at which Disney's revisionism stops. And this needs to be the line in the sand, because they've gotten away with revisionism and alterations of films for far too long, since at least the early 90s, with their own animated titles, in terms of their over-intensive digital cleanups and bastardizations of their own films. And now that this is starting to happen with the Fox titles they acquired, it really needs to stop. And this should be a wake-up call for people that Disney's revisionism is horrible and has always been horrible. So to Disney's revisionism, I only have one thing to say, which I think is appropriate in regards to the French Connection, which of course is the iconic And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.